Let's welcome Dr. Abdelmalek.
Well, thank you very much for that very gracious and generous introduction. And I thank the program organizers for the invitation to be here in beautiful Southern California. And happy Father's Day to all those fathers out there. You guys truly need a testament of appreciation for what you put through to raise those children and everything. So happy Father's Day. Here are my disclosures and my learning objectives. As has been heard, I do a lot of research across the board in NAFLD and NASH. And so I've been commissioned to discuss the goals of pharmacotherapy and to really review this very vibrant and emerging landscape. But for your purposes, I'm really going to try and focus on what I think is going to be on the immediate emerging horizon. So those compounds that are in phase 3 clinical trials that are going to be approaching FDA review or potentially approval in the upcoming 1 to 2 years. Now, I've made the assumption that we all here understand what NAFLD and NASH is, and this is a condition that's highly and strongly associated with metabolic syndrome and diabetes, accumulation of fat with necroinflammation in the liver, and in some patients can be very progressive and progress to cirrhosis. So we've debunked the dogma of this being a benign condition. It is clearly very progressive and the leading cause of cirrhosis currently, not only in this country, but increasing worldwide. So the goal of NASH treatment is to prevent, arrest, or reverse the primary predictor of clinical outcomes in liver disease, which is liver fibrosis. And so many of the pharmacotherapeutics that are being developed are focused on reversing liver injury, steatohepatitis, or fibrosis. And so the liver-directed pharmacotherapy should generally be limited to those currently, at least, with biopsy-proven NASH, although that landscape is changing with the development of biomarkers, and those with clinically significant fibrosis, those that have at least stage 2 fibrosis or higher, because that is the highest group that is likely going to progress. Not those with stage 0 are not going to develop any clinically meaningful outcomes in the immediate horizon. So prevention of advanced liver disease, liver failure, and ultimately even liver cancer is one of the root goals of treating NASH and hopefully eventually to improve morbidity and mortality. So the potential therapeutic targets for NAFLD and NASH can be considered in buckets, if you will. There are anti-metabolic therapies that really target metabolism, insulin resistance, fat deposition, lipotoxicity, and that class of therapies could include anything from GLP-1 receptor agonists, FGF19, FGF21, some of the PPAR agonists, any of the anti-metabolic therapies that we are using for diabetes or even obesity management. There are other buckets of therapeutics, such as the anti-inflammatory therapies, and we've seen in this class of drugs medications that may alter inflammatory signaling, T-cell regulation, and of course the anti-fibrotic buckets that are affecting direct collagen deposition, stellate cell activation, and sadly we haven't had any great strides in direct anti-fibrotic therapies, many of whom which have failed in clinical trials, and whether that's attributable to the drug potency, or our trial design itself is up for debate. But as you could see, very complex integrated pathways that drive NAFLD and NASH, and because of those very integrated pathways, this is in fact the emerging landscape of treatment. Now, we didn't have a drug 20 years ago. We still recommend diet and exercise. That is the foundation of treatment. But on the very outer border here, you could see therapies that are actually in phase 1 clinical trials. And as we move closer to the center of this circle, we see drugs that are now currently in late-stage clinical trials. And what sits here in the center of this circle is GLP-1 receptor agonists, semaglutide, a pan-PPAR, lanafibrinor, obeticholic acid, which is an FXR agonist, thyroid hormone receptor agonist, which is resmetiron. And so all those drugs that are currently appear to be shaded out in gray are the many compounds that have failed in clinical trials and will not be proceeding further. So the rest of my talk is going to focus here on this center because it's unclear to me how much you need to know of the therapies that are emerging, and I'm going to focus on those drugs that are currently really in play and close to FDA review or approval. So let's start off with the FXR agonist, obeticholic acid. And I don't know if any of you have been following the news lately, but obeticholic acid just underwent on May 19th a federal FDA hearing, an open public call for comments, and in a very deliberate review of the risk-benefit ratio of this compound for the treatment of NAFLD and NASH. And as a drug class, FXR agonists really affect multiple different pathways and processes in fatty liver disease and in liver disease in general, because obeticholic acid is already approved for the indication of primary biliary cholangitis and is currently under investigation for non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. It should not be used off-label for the treatment of NAFLD and NASH. But FXR agonists affect stellate cell activation and fibrosis. They also have been shown to decrease inflammatory markers such as TNF-alpha, can in fact increase serum lipids, increase LDL, which can be mitigated with statin therapy, and affects glucose metabolism. But the primary mechanism of action is through bile duct, affecting bile duct recirculation and homeostasis, and in that pathway has been felt to alter and improve potential risk of fibrosis progression. So there have been a very large global study called the REGENERATE trial. The REGENERATE trial evaluated the role of obeticholic acid for the treatment of NASH after the initial Flint study by the NASH CRN came out, and it's evaluating placebo versus 10 milligrams versus 25 milligrams of obeticholic acid in a study that's actually ongoing now and going to span 5+ years to try and achieve a clinically meaningful outcome of how patients feel, function, and survive, remembering that liver histology is in fact a surrogate of that. So the approvable FDA endpoints are improvement in NASH without worsening of fibrosis, or improvement in fibrosis without worsening of NASH. And this study actually went through 2 independent reviews of liver histology, and there was one that was initially done by a central read, and then another that went in accordance with the FDA for consensus review. And as you could see here, there's an approximately 10 to 12% placebo-corrected response rate for improved fibrosis without worsening of NASH, and this held true with the consensus read. And when we evaluated those with baseline F2, again, statistically significant improvement in fibrosis, even in those patients with F3 fibrosis that are closer to transition to cirrhosis, had a statistically significant improvement in fibrosis. Now, why the deliberation? Well, certainly not any treatment is going to be without its risk, particularly for asymptomatic disease. And one of the concerns that came up that was deliberated by the FDA is there or is there not a potential risk for drug-induced liver injury? And as you can see here, this is kind of what we call a fish plot. Those patients that had exposure to obeticholic acid, there were over 8,000 patient years of exposure reviewed. And generally speaking, those patients that are on placebo here are in blue, and those patients that were put on obeticholic acid are in red and green at the various doses. And what we're seeing is, in fact, a potential improvement trends towards lowering of ALT. However, there was a notable increase in treatment emergent adverse events, predominantly pruritus that occurred in almost 50% of patients at the highest dose as well, and that was kind of deliberated. One of the other notable events is while we did see an LDL signal with obeticholic acid, there was no increase in acute myocardial infarctions. It was risk mitigated. However, as you could see, there's a slight increase in gallbladder disease and gallstones. Now, one could argue if patients who are obese and diabetic have in the background an increased risk for gallstones, but this was noted. It was not statistically significant, but in the context of an obstructed bile duct, there could be concerns for increased bioavailability of obeticholic acid in the liver and associated drug-induced liver injury. And so with the advisory board committee and the deliberation of the FDA, there was a concern as to whether the higher dose of obeticholic acid could have precipitated one complication of drug-induced liver injury resulting in death in the context of an obstructed bile duct with gallstones. And so the probable or possible nature of DILI gave the FDA some heed to say, really, we're going to vote against approval on the basis of surrogate endpoints at this juncture, and we want to see this drug follow for longer-term outcomes related to effectively a change in clinical outcomes, how patients feel, function, or survive. So I'm very hopeful that Intercept will continue with their long-term studies to achieve these endpoints. But as of now, it was not approved on what we call Subpart H approval, which is contingent approval pending clinically meaningful outcomes. And so more to come with obeticholic acid. So what about Resmetiron? Resmetiron is soon going to be, and potentially has started the FDA review process. And Resmetiron is a thyroid hormone beta receptor agonist. And this really addresses the biology of subclinical hypothyroidism, intrahepatic hypothyroidism. We're not talking about systemic hypothyroidism, we're talking about tissue hypothyroidism. And what resmetiron does is actually in a patient who has a diseased liver, the ratio of T3 to reverse T3 is actually reversed. And so resmetiron, through the activation of deiodinases, corrects that ratio of T3 to reverse T3 and making more available active thyroid hormone at the tissue level. And through this mechanism of correcting intrahepatic hypothyroidism has been shown to improve NAFLD and NASH. So this is the trial design related to the Maestro study. The Maestro study is, again, a global phase 3 trial that is ongoing. It included patients with biopsy-proven NASH who also had significant fat quantification on liver biopsy by FibroScan or MRI, and preferentially enrolled patients with fibrosis stage 2 or 3. It was a long-term parallel study of placebo versus 80 versus 100 milligrams of resmetiron. And these are the results. Resolution of NASH occurred again at 10% versus 30% at the highest dose, and improvement in fibrosis was also noted by more than one stage, almost a 12% placebo corrected response rate like we saw with obeticholic acid. The difference here is that the secondary endpoints, we're seeing cholesterol lowering. So the potential for a very favorable cardiometabolic profile is appearing with resmetiron as opposed to obeticholic acid. And so it'll be interesting to see those outcomes. And it certainly has shown itself to be safe, well tolerated, and the adverse events have been consistent with its former studies. And the only side effect described with resmetiron has been transient loose stools, mild nausea at the onset of treatment, but otherwise, as you could see, very favorable safety profile that didn't appear to be significantly different from the placebo treatment arm. So more to come with the FDA, probably in either fourth quarter 2023 or first quarter 2024. Now, what about the PPAN? Now, you know, pioglitazone is a peroxisome proliferator, activated receptor gamma. Alpha is generally fenofibrate. Delta has also been used, but Lanafibrinor is an equally balanced PPAR. And the PPAR class, gamma especially, has been known to affect angiogenesis and adipocyte biology and decrease inflammation. The gamma has also been demonstrated to affect stellate cell activation, and in animals has been antifibrotic. The alpha moiety affects fatty acid oxidation and ketogenesis, and the delta also has an effect on the peripheral muscles to improve insulin sensitivity. So by targeting all the isoforms of these nuclear receptor hormones, the theory is that we can get an anti-steatotic, anti-inflammatory, and an anti-fibrotic benefit with a PPAR. And so lanafibranor has been studied in the phase 2 native study, and this was a parallel biopsy trial that actually only spanned 24 weeks, unlike the other studies. It was a very short trial, placebo 800 versus 1200 milligrams of lanafibranor, 247 patients that were enrolled with the intent to treat analysis, and an entrance liver biopsy that necessitated the presence of NASH with fibrosis stage 2 to 3, as well as an end of treatment liver biopsy at week 24. And this was what was demonstrated, the primary endpoint of a reduction in 2 points in what we call the SAF scoring system, which really overscores necroinflammation and ballooning injury, and enriches predominantly for more fibrosis, the scoring system. But there was an improvement in the scoring system of NASH using the SAF scoring system. The secondary endpoint of improvement in fibrosis was also met compared to placebo with the higher dose, and a dose-dependent improvement in NASH without worsening of fibrosis. So what we did observe is an improvement in insulin sensitivity, and also an improvement in HDL cholesterol and triglyceride lowering. So again, also appears to have a favorable cardiometabolic profile. The serum markers for lipid metabolism, insulin resistance, glycemic control all improved at week 24. Lanafibranor improved the markers of inflammation, such as TIMP1 and MAC3, compared to placebo. It was well tolerated. However, in keeping with the gamma, pioglitazone, for example, which is the Actos, there was a very minor weight gain that can be observed with the PPAR gamma effect. And certainly patients who are obese want to lose weight, not gain weight, but the theory of creating more healthy metabolic weight gain as opposed to unhealthy. But there is a minor weight gain with this agent. But again, as you could see, very well tolerated compared to placebo. But the weight gain did potentially raise some concern and deliberation. Now, we've also seen a repurposing of GLP-1 receptor agonists, particularly semaglutide. Now, the GLP-1, the Hollywood craze, this is a drug that everybody seems to want to effectively lose weight and cut appetite. And this class of drugs does decrease satiety. And it's actually been also shown to decrease the urge for alcohol consumption, so is currently being transitioned to be utilized in alcohol-related liver disease. However, it improves satiety, and it has been shown to have favorable cardiometabolic benefits on heart-related outcomes, kidney-related outcomes, and decrease hepatic glucose production, while also decreasing fat and adipose tissue storage. And it certainly has an effect on weight loss. And it has been a study done in patients with biopsy-proven NASH by Phil Newsom. It was published in 2021 New England Journal, that included patients who had biopsy-proven NASH with stage 2 and 3 fibrosis, who were certainly at least diabetic or non-diabetic with glycosylated hemoglobins less than 10, and it did a steady dose escalation in the GLP-1 because certainly this class of drugs has associated gastrointestinal symptoms early on with use. And they followed patients out for 72 weeks and did an end of treatment biopsy, with the primary endpoint being resolution of NASH with no worsening of fibrosis, or improvement in fibrosis with no worsening of NASH. And what semaglutide showed at week 72 is it hit all the endpoints of NASH resolution in a dose-dependent manner. But at 72 weeks, it did not have an effect on fibrosis. So this certainly appears to be a drug that improves hepatic steatosis and necroinflammation, and maybe it didn't have an effect on fibrosis because, I remind you, there are no GLP-1 receptors in the liver, so this drug appears to be working more upstream on metabolism. It did improve in a dose-dependent manner weight, and it also improved in a dose-dependent manner glycemic control. So it is already approved and on the market for obesity and diabetes, and we saw the same effect in patients with NAFLD and NASH. But here, what did become evident is over 72 weeks, there appears to be a protective effect against fibrosis progression. So what we do see is in the placebo arm, almost 19% who had fibrosis worsening over 72 weeks, but in the highest dose of semaglutide, only 5%. So while this wasn't statistically significant in improving fibrosis in 72 weeks, maybe it was protective against fibrosis worsening. This is currently being evaluated in the Global Essence study, and so more to come. So what does the future hold? What's next? Well, what's around the corner, I could say, is second generation therapies, second generation FXRs, second generation thyroid hormone beta receptor agonists. And what we're seeing emerge in clinical trials is not only the single agonists with the incretins, but the dual and triple agonists, and even more potent FGF21 agonists such as pegozafermin or efruxifermin. And let me show you how these compounds have been shown to perform even in early phase 2A or 2B clinical trials. There's a compound by Humney Pharmaceuticals, which is a triple agonist for GLP-1, GIP, and glucagon. And the reason for the addition of glucagon, it's been shown in animal models to actually improve hepatic fibrosis. So the bundling of this pegylated compound has been studied in patients who had MR-based imaging of NAFLD at least 10%, who were non-diabetic and obese, with the primary outcome of safety. And it was done as an initial early dose escalation study of 0.2 to 0.8 milligrams. But this is what happened. Nearly 80 to 100% of patients defatted the liver within 12 weeks. Complete loss of hepatic steatosis on imaging. And so it was shown to be safe, had the same side effect profile as GLP-1. The glucagon did create a glucose excursion a little bit that was managed with insulin sensitizers. But as you could see here, there are potent drugs on the horizon that potentially have the ability to defat the liver within 12 to 24 weeks. Now, efruxifermin is getting a lot of attention too. This is an FGF21 molecule. It's been studied in the Harmony phase 2B study. It was enriched for patients with diabetes and F3 fibrosis, which are harder to treat, potentially rapid progressor type of patients. And as you could see, at least by FibroScan, a significant 64% reduction in mean liver stiffness by week 24. And what was also noted is the percent of patients who had fat reduction at week 24, 77% at the higher dose of efruxifermin, and complete normalization of fat, 51%. So defatting of the liver in 51% of patients. And what this translated into in 24 weeks was NASH resolution without worsening of fibrosis on biopsy in 76% of patients. and an improvement in fibrosis in 41% of patients compared to 5% on placebo, and 15% of patients at the higher dose, actually at both doses, approximately 15% had two-stage improvements in fibrosis regression. So this was associated with a reduction in serum fibrosis markers, PRO-C3, ELF score, and liver stiffness by FibroScan. So what does this mean? Well, it means we got a very exciting and vibrant drug development program for the treatment of NASH, 2 compounds which are currently under FDA review, 3 which are in long-term phase clinical trials, Lanafibrinor, as well as Resmetiron, Obeticholic acid, and very potent therapies that are transitioning from phase 2 to phase 3. I suspect in the future, given the complexity and interrelatedness of these complex metabolic, inflammatory, and fibrotic pathways, we're likely going to be combining anti-metabolic therapy with anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic therapies that are tailored to the clinical or histologic or metabolic phenotype of a patient. And we'll be hopefully having an armamentarium of drugs that we can pick and choose from based on the right patient. So a lean NAFLD patient may be treated somewhat differently than an obese diabetic NAFLD patient with advanced hepatic fibrosis, and more to come in that landscape. So my take-home message is, clearly the clinical burden of NAFLD is absolutely huge, and with obeticholic acid and resmetiron currently under FDA review, we are reaching kind of a last marathon pathway towards hopefully soon FDA deliberation and hopefully approval in the upcoming 1 to 2 years. The therapies, however, and what we've learned from the deliberation of the FDA by and for obeticholic acid is, if we are going to roll out pharmacotherapies for a liver disease that is so prevalent and for which general prescribers may have the ability to prescribe, these therapies are going to have a very favorable risk-benefit ratio. No question about it. And that favorable risk-benefit ratio has to go beyond just liver health alone. Our patients are at risk for cardiovascular disease, for diabetes, and the FDA is going to be deliberating not only liver-related outcomes, but all-cause risk and outcomes, and particularly the concern for drug-related liver injury. The anti-metabolic therapies demonstrate a benefit against NASH and the promise for halting fibrosis progression, and in my opinion, likely will be a backbone of any combination therapies in the future. Potent therapies, potentially the dual and triple agonists that are emerging, or the FGF1 compounds, are going to be on the horizon and will be evaluated in combination with the other compounds that are currently in phase 3. And so combination therapies using these targeted pharmacotherapies against different mechanisms of action will likely be the future of NASH therapeutics. And with that, I thank you. And certainly a lot of thanks goes out to the many patients, the sponsors, the investigators that really made this entire field possible.